Hey everybody, this is Vegan Theology episode 43 with Kevin and Sarah Hale. How's it going?
You're going to notice, I think, that we got our morning voices going on.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't think we've ever recorded this early in the day,
yeah,
which is fun.
a little different. Yeah, we're working through Lisa Kemmerer's Animals and World Religions. She is a professor of philosophy, religion, etc. at Montana State University, Billings. And very good book so far. And I'm sure it's going to be throughout, but as I read it, I'm just like, wow, so much to think about.
Yeah.
It's hard. I'm going to say it's hard reading this kind of thing, but like, it's just, I don't read straight through. I read this bit and I'm like, oh man, and I'm thinking about it, and it just takes a little time to read because it just creates all these other thoughts and makes me want to go check this, compare it to this book and whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we're hitting chapter 1 today, Indigenous Traditions, which, like Kevin said, was fascinating.
Yeah.
And in case we need to, because it's a new word, Lisa Kemmerer has actually invented a word that she uses throughout this book. So when she's quoting other scholars, of course, they don't use this word. But when she's writing, you'll hear this word come up, and it's animals.
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 Animals. Like Sarah said, when she's quoting other scholars and they use the word animal, you'll hear the word animal in those quotes or read them. But when she's speaking in her voice, she uses the term animals.
Yeah. Just to kind of review, because again, it's new to us, there's a lexical gap when talking about non-human animals. So you have a choice when you're talking about them, either to call them animals, which ignores the fact that we as human beings, as Homo sapiens, are in fact animals, every bit as much as any other species. So that's problematic. But if you use a phrase like non-human animals or other than human animals or beyond human animals, that starts to become really cumbersome in the conversation, in the writing. So to fix this problem, she invented this word animal, which just reminds you that, so yeah, it kind of meets this happy medium. It doesn't deny that we are animals, and it's not this cumbersome phrase. It's a word that just means all species of animals except the speaker's species, in this case, human beings.
Right, and it also doesn't create false dichotomies, right? When you say non-human animals, it's like humans and then everyone else.
Yeah.
Whereas this word animals, like you said, when you use it, you're referring to everyone else, including humans. If you were a monkey or a chimpanzee and you could sign, you would use the word animals, and humans would be included in animals, but you wouldn't be as if you were speaking. So if that makes sense.
Yes, so you'll hear that word come up. So let's get into it.
Yeah, reading the first chapter. Unlike other chapters in this book, the present chapter does not deal with one particular religious tradition. Unlike religions discussed in subsequent chapters, indigenous religious traditions do not share a founder, as do Buddhists and Muslims, for example, nor do they share a particular body of sacred texts, as do Hindus and Jews, for example. Indigenous religious traditions tend to be similar in critical ways, but each tradition is distinct and separate. I use the term indigenous traditions throughout this chapter, but I use the term only as a generalization. While most indigenous religious traditions will fit within the pattern mentioned herein, the vast majority, in fact, it is always likely that there is an exception to the rule.
Already, I'm like, that's so interesting. Every other chapter in this book, the religion that we're going to look at has a founder and has its own sacred texts.
Right.
So this one's unique. We'll be looking at people groups from all over the globe. One thing I just keep coming back to is the fact that people from every corner of the world had very, very similar beliefs and values.
Yeah.
You just have to ask, how? How did that happen?
Right. No, it is fascinating as you're reading it because I think we spoke of the axial age. That's when the big major religions formed kind of in the same era. And yet here you've got how there's this common thread almost. There are these common values throughout all these different traditions around the world. And yeah, some of them strikingly similar to Christianity, the Christian origin story in Genesis, and you're just like, whoa, how is this? This before Christian missionaries showed up, right?
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
And another thing that kept coming up for both of us was, wow, the way they believed, their value system, how they view the rest of the world feels so much like proper stewardship that we
Right.
keep trying to envision
Yeah.
and articulate. And
Yeah. I feel like that is probably, it's the thought in the back of my head. I think as we've been doing this podcast from the beginning to even through Valera, all of it, I've just had this sense of stewardship. Like we're doing it wrong in our Christian tradition, in present day Christianity, in America at least, probably in the Western tradition. We're not doing stewardship correctly. This book especially really is shining a light on that to me. And I feel like one of the takeaways is going to be, once we've done and read it and assessed it all, this sense of what is stewardship, and should stewardship look something like the values in this book.
in the indigenous tradition, or maybe in
In all of it. I'm
Yeah.
I'm curious to know as we progress, because I think that was part of the intro, that, hey, all these traditions, all these religious traditions share these common values.
Exactly.
And I just wonder if, when we're done, like, oh, here's a model for stewardship.
Yeah, there were a lot of things. It was like, whoa, that sounds like the biblical narrative, or whoa, that lines up perfectly with our theology. Or one of the first things she does is define what the word indigenous means, after all.
Yeah.
And she gives some interesting examples of what it might mean. And is it a matter of birth or location or lifestyle? Is indigenous rooted in a way of believing and thinking and living? Or is indigenous a matter of genetics?
Kemmerer says, indigenous literally means native. If we take this term literally, evidence suggests that all human beings are indigenous to Africa. There are no native humans in the Americas, Russia, or Japan. There are no indigenous Brazilians, Indonesians, or Chinese. We are all immigrants, except humans living in Africa. Whether yellow, red, or white, humans are native only to Africa. Some of us have arrived in Europe, New Zealand, or Canada more recently, whereas others migrated long ago. Each group of people has changed somewhat physically due to centuries of genetic isolation. But when we arrived in our current location is not important with regard to the term indigenous.
So how does she define the term indigenous? She says, for the purposes of this chapter, indigenous religious traditions refer to spiritual beliefs and practices that existed before the advent of Jewish, Confucian, Taoist, or Hindu traditions. It's basically a time definition, a matter of time.
Yeah.
Indigenous religious traditions are all the spiritual beliefs that existed before the Jewish tradition came on the scene, Confucian, Taoist, or Hindu. She says there's a remarkable similarity when you look at these across the globe.
Right.
There's a considerable similarity with regard to indigenous teachings concerning human relations with animals and the rest of the world. She says, we're going to be using the present tense when we talk about these traditions, and we're not assessing whether or not the particular groups of indigenous peoples mentioned continue to honor these ancient beliefs and life ways. As with other chapters in this book, religious teachings and practices are presented without attempting to assess whether or not a particular spiritual tradition is honored. As noted in the introduction, this book focuses on religious ideals rather than actual beliefs and practices.
Yeah. This chapter explores beliefs, myths, and practices from a plethora of indigenous peoples around the world. This kaleidoscope of indigenous religious beliefs and practices demonstrates that despite a lack of shared origins and texts, indigenous religious traditions tend to share important similarities concerning rightful relations between humans and non-humans.
She cites so many scholars in this book. I was thinking about going back and just counting how many different scholars she cites.
Right.
But I didn't get around to that. The work of so many different scholars appear in this. With each point that she makes, describing the traditions, she'll give 3 or 4 examples from different people groups around the world.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking about writing this chapter. That must have been quite a lot of research.
I was thinking that too.
Yeah.
I think it's impressive.
Right.
And then she gets into the importance of myth, which is an interesting word in itself.
Right.
The popular understanding of the word myth is just something that's false.
Right. Exactly.
And perhaps maybe more from an anthropological perspective, the word myth has a very rich meaning, which I think I could just summarize by saying the stories and the beliefs and the traditions that people are raised in that explain to them what the world is and who they are and how they should live within the world.
Right. And she has this sentence, which I like. It says, myths are a living reality intended to guide daily life. Gives you a framework, right? Myths give you, like you said, a story, a narrative to help you understand your worldview, your cultural worldview. And why the world is what it is and why you do what you do. And they're very true, right, to these cultural people and these traditions.
And it's so interesting that we as humans need myth to exist.
Well, and that's what everyone says, right? At the end of the day, I mean, all these business gurus are always talking about story. Nothing happens outside of a story, right?
Yeah. So she calls it sacred wisdom. And it's definitely not looked at as just old fairy tales or old stories that we like to sit around and talk about.
Yeah.
It has everything to do with telling us how we are to show up, how we are to live. All right. So now we get into, like, what do they actually believe?
Right.
And I thought it would be good to have a little tiny discussion here.
Yeah.
About as we explore other cultures, other religious traditions that are sometimes markedly different than our own. Culture is so powerful.
Right.
And I think it's important to just notice and name that we may experience internal resistance as we try to get our heads around different people's cultures and religions.
Right.
I noticed, even for myself as I was reading through this book, a little bit of skepticism.
Yeah.
Because it did sound so foreign to my ear as a Westerner, as an American, feeling like, okay, do they really think like that? Do they really believe that?
Yeah.
Because that's just not how the world works.
Right.
Through my Western grid.
Well, I know similarly, right? I've studied theology, but a little philosophy. And I think as we're trained up young in America, living in a Western tradition, we think in this very dualistic kind of way. And I think that's what modern day science has done to us, right? There's the material world and there's the non-material world. And those categories, that's how we see the world. And typically we're kind of indoctrinated that everything material is real and true and factual, and everything non-material is kind of, well, we can't really know, so we shouldn't conjecture until it's proven. And yet many of these indigenous traditions are very, not dualistic, but monistic. Everything is one. The spiritual ancestors that have passed, the real world. Yeah, and I worked with a guy at a company I worked at. His name was Stanford, and he was from
Zimbabwe.
Yeah, he was from Zimbabwe. And I asked him this question about this monistic metaphysic of how they see the world. And here he is in a Western culture. He actually went to Harvard and totally embracing Western culture. And yet, he was trying to explain it to me. And I feel like it's one of the things that I've struggled with. Like intellectually, I can understand this concept of monism. And I think one of the examples is people living today in Africa, they crack open a beer and they pour a little bit on the ground before they take a drink. And the reason they're doing that is they're giving the first of it to their ancestors. They're sharing it, and they're very real to them. And, Stanford said, this is totally the way it is. This is how we think. And for me, like I said, intellectually, I get it, but there's a part of me, I want to use the word existentially, like I don't feel it. Like I need to feel it to really get it. You know what I mean?
Totally.
Got to live it.
Yep.
And that's sometimes what's difficult, I think, for Westerners is we can maybe comprehend it intellectually, but we're not living it. We don't fully embrace it.
Right. I think that the little bit of experience I've had learning about and practicing yoga and yoga philosophy and tradition has helped me to start to see a little bit more in a monistic way. And I also, honestly, I think veganism has helped me see the world through a more monistic way.
Yeah.
Because I start to see the person in all kinds of other species. We are certainly explicitly, not just implicitly, we are explicitly taught that our culture, the Western culture, the Western way, especially capitalism, is so superior to the rest of the world. We are taught that in our education system. Western educational systems explicitly teach that.
Right.
That science and the way of doing business and the way we invent and our ingenuity, it's all superior to the rest of the world.
Right.
And this is the way the real world works. And look how we've taken over the world, and look the ways that we've made the world better, quote, better,
Right.
with our inventions and ingenuity. And look how all the people from the other countries want to be here. They all want to be us.
Well, and also how we're taking advantage of them so easily, and it's almost like they're laying down for us. But no, we're totally dominating them and destroying them in the process. And I feel like that's not their worldview. That's not their ethic. Their ethic is not to capitalize and commodify every single thing and squeeze every ounce of money or monetary value out of everything. And so that's why they're not doing it.
Yep.
But we come in and we start squeezing everything out of everything. And I think sometimes the Western mind is like, well, you've got all these amazing resources. Why aren't you extracting everything you can out of them? And that's just not the way they look at the world. They're way more holistic. There's value in so many things. They're not just emphasizing one value over the others.
Right. How superior are we when you look at what we've polluted and decimated and made to go extinct? And the ecosystems we've destroyed.
Right, because you could start to wonder, well, what are our values? Our value is we love to destroy everything.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I mean, that's the legacy. That's going to be the legacy of capitalism. It's already becoming the legacy of capitalism.
Or Christianity, because of our infatuation with this idea that the image of God in the human being, we're the only ones that matter.
Right, we're far superior to everything.
And everything is here for us to exploit. Yeah. It's a fascinating conversation. Culture is a fascinating conversation. As we go through this book, being able to recognize, oh, I feel some resistance coming up. I wonder what that's about. Will help us stay really honest.
Yeah.
I think any culture has merits, but any culture also has things that are not great or not admirable.
Right.
As we went through this chapter, at least, I kept coming up with a question. The way the indigenous people look at the world, is that more of a godly perspective than the one that we were raised with?
Right. I had similar thoughts too, and I'm sure we'll get into that.
All right. She starts out her description of what they believe, saying indigenous peoples do not generally hold an idea of nature separate and apart from humanity or from the spirit world. Instead, they most often view the supernatural world as here among us, and they tend to view humans as just one part of a perpetual sacred life that encompasses the entire cosmos. This is kind of getting to what you were saying. All are infused with spirit, whether humans, plants, animals, and the environment is a place of worship that sustains all forms of life. Yeah, this idea that everything has life force, everything has spirit. Everything is sacred.
Yeah.
Supernatural and natural become one in the indigenous worldview. And mythology invariably provides a spiritual outlook of admiration and respect for the natural world in and of itself. Everything in the world has value just by existing.
Right.
For indigenous peoples, nature is often viewed as a temple. And within this sanctuary, people ought to show great respect to every form, function, and power.
I got to say, that's fascinating right there, because, I mean, this is where this chapter really made me think about our Old Testament story in Genesis and how probably we've westernized we know that the Greek thinking has taken over New Testament Christianity, and our theology is very Greek, and yet it seems like it's been placed over the Old Testament. And I think reading this chapter, seeing everything we're pulling out of here, I'm realizing, I bet you the early Abrahamic tribes, they were very indigenous. The way that Eden is written, the Genesis story at the beginning, Genesis 1, Genesis 2, it seems to me it's very similar because we've talked about how Eden is a temple, and we've talked about how in the eternal state is going to be the whole earth, heaven and earth together is going to be a temple to God. And our jobs were to take Eden and spread it out over the entire globe. And by the way, we've quoted Old Testament scholar John Walton many times, and in his Genesis commentary, he speaks about how Genesis is not a science book, but it's really thinking in those terms, and he uses the terms form and function. We've talked about this, but that was fascinating to me.
I know. It's like, oh, there's some overlap. There's some similarities here. Yeah. One of the examples she gives is the Yukon distant time stories. So these people are up north in the Yukon.
Yeah.
Their mythology, for example, teach people to serve nature, all of nature, the dominant force. And she contrasts this with Western dualistic thinking, exactly what I think Kevin described really well.
Continuing on here, Indigenous peoples often feel a sense of responsibility to maintain the continuity and balance of the cosmos. The Cree, from North Dakota, Montana, and north into Canada, note that when humans live in balanced reciprocity with animals, each creates the continued conditions for the survival of the other as members of a society. When people do not live in a respectful and responsible way, the web of life is shaken, endangering the existence of all who live in the extended community. The Nahua, near Mexico City, understand that their surroundings, Samanahuac, that which surrounds us, are not only essential for their survival, but for the survival of all that dwell therein. All of nature is important for the existence of any one being. Wow.
So different.
I know. And I love that. After reading this, I really want to go back and study the essence of Genesis and find out kind of what this book is bringing out. If God has created this habitat for animals and he has a relationship with animals, there's a lot of value in that. And who are we to get in the middle of that? And I feel like this brings it out. And now we're learning how we're destroying the environment and destroying habitats for other animals. That affects us as humans. Like we are in this, I hate to use the word symbiotic relationship, but we really are. We're all connected.
Yeah, that which we do to the world, that which we do to other species, we are doing to ourselves.
I know.
We are just now figuring that out. Some of us are just figuring that out, yeah. In the Popol Vuh mythology, that's a Mayan mythology, human bodies are formed with corn, symbolic of the reality that humans cannot live without plant life. I love that.
Yeah.
In that mythology, animals of the earth and the plants and land itself do not belong to people. Rather, people belong to the earth. She talks about Wareo people from Venezuela. And one thing that was so interesting about them is they identify all animals, including themselves, with the root form of areo, meaning life. That's common with a lot of these people's languages, is if you were to translate it literally, there are fish people, there are tree people, they're all people. The Wareo classify species according to eco-niches. This is so interesting. They classify species according to eco-niches, water, land, trees, or air, according to where they sleep.
I know.
This is their taxonomy of how they break down the world, where someone sleeps. They categorize species according to those who sleep in the ground, on the ground, terrestrial, in flood forest pools and channels or swamp streams, aquatic, in tree trunks or in tree overstories, arboreal. So life forms are thus viewed as aquatic, terrestrial, or aerial. Humans typically would be in the terrestrial animal category. However, some people in their world live in the trees. And so those humans would actually, because they dwell and sleep in trees, would fall into a different category from human communities that live and sleep on the ground. Given the interconnected nature of indigenous understandings, this makes perfect sense.
Yeah. No, I know. It does make perfect sense. It's pretty logical. In this worldview, humans are the equals of the maize, the llama, the mountains, the stars, rocks, lakes, the departed who are also alive, and so on. All are nature. Humans do not feel alienated from her, nor superior to her. Humans are not distant from nature. They are part of nature. Humans feel that all are their Ailu, a Quechua word that in its broadest sense refers to the family that extends beyond just the human relatives. The rocks, the rivers, the sun, the moon, the plants, the animals are all members of the Ailu. All those that are found in the territory where they live in community are their Ailu.
Yeah, the idea that everything around me is part of my family is it's beautiful.
Right.
And it resonates on some level.
Right.
But it feels foreign. It feels like, like that's not the way I was raised at all. She goes on to talk about how that means humans have a moral obligation to animals and to all of creation.
Yeah.
And I love some of the examples she gives. For example, before clearing a new patch of ground, the Bhima Sayoras of Central and Southeast India show respect and compassion by offering a prayer to acknowledge that they are, quote, robbing wild creatures of their homes, and thereby endangering the lives of these members of their extended community. In that same prayer, they ask creatures big and small to go away with their children so that people might cultivate this land without causing harm to Indian game chickens or gaur of the ox family. The Bhima Sayoras recognize clearing a patch of forest for cultivation as an encroachment on the right to life of other creatures of the forest. Not wanting to clash with them, they ask the animals to move away with their children. The terms they use, such as children, reveal their beliefs that the animals of the forest have the same status as human beings. I think all the time about how we just go in and we start construction in our little area. We have these ground squirrels.
Right.
And a lot of times construction begins right at the time when they're all having their babies.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, this is probably the worst time of the year that we could go in and start digging up the ground for them. The fact that these people, it's not that they are able always, even in these indigenous societies, they weren't always able to not disrupt other species.
I know.
They recognize that we're disrupting other species to do what we need to do, but they're doing it with as little violence and as little disrespect as possible. At least they're taking it into consideration. They take it seriously. The Nicobarese from the Nicobar Islands east of mainland India also view the entirety of the natural world as part of their sacred moral community. They talk to plants while they gather leaves, begging forgiveness for taking the plant's leaves, and explaining why they have to do so. For the Nicobarese, there is animate life even in plants and trees, and they must maintain polite and respectful relations with these green and growing beings. Their conversations with plants reveal humility, a recognition that they do not own other living entities, and that they cause harm by taking plants' leaves. Their words are directed to the leaves and the plants, but their conversation is an ongoing dialogue with the cosmos, a conversation that is fundamentally spiritual in nature. The indigenous people of the Nicobar Islands, through this ongoing communication, are reminded that they cannot take perpetually. The plants need their leaves, and there's a limit to that which humans may take and legitimately ask forgiveness. This is amazing to me. Our tradition is just take it. Take.
Right.
The question of, yeah, we can do that, but should we? That is so rarely a conversation in the scientific world or in the capitalist world. Like, should we? Should we do this? Well, if we can, of course we're going to.
Right.
And if we don't, somebody else will. Yeah. This idea that everything that exists in nature has its limits, can be exhausted, and is invaluable. The Nahua know that they cannot live without their ecosystem, and they view everything within the natural world as worthy of respect. I can't help but think of Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree, which again is in every elementary classroom in the country, I think.
Yeah.
Everybody loves the beautiful book, but I've always been convinced that we as Westerners don't really even get the message he's trying to send in that book. If you just continue to take from nature, at some point, nature will have nothing left to give us.
Yeah. As part of a larger, mutually dependent community with a shared morality, the Nahua expect that other creatures will also take from human beings. For example, the Nahua do not seek to eliminate competitive species, but expect other animals to eat part of their crops and food stores. When they see a Mexican jay enjoying a few of their freshly planted seeds, or a field mouse seeking sustenance in their food stores, they are neither surprised nor moved to deadly violence. For the Nahua, sharing is common sense. How could any reasonable human being thrive while forcing others to starve? Wow.
I think this is where I started feeling a little skepticism. Really? You don't care if other animals are eating your crops? Because I grew up in a very agricultural community.
Yeah.
And this is not how people think. I mean, we will spray poisons even if we know they cause humans to have cancer.
Right.
Just to make sure that other animals don't eat our crops.
Right.
She gives another example from the Andean culture, kind of along the same lines. They expect natural elements and wild creatures to share what they cultivate. So these experienced agriculturalists plant a furrow for the hail, another furrow for the frost, another for insects, because they recognize all of these realities of nature as members of their family. They do not worry when the frost lightly burns the leaves of their crops. They say, the frost has come to take its portion.
Yeah.
When the snow comes late in spring and destroys leafy vegetables, when a busy mole uproots growing greens, Andean peasants recognize that the whole family, the larger community, has come to the table. With such an outlook, there is little room for anger or disappointment when a deer mouse or silvery-throated jay shares in the bounty. There's no incentive to eradicate other species or prevent animals from taking what they need to live, even if they take that which humans have cultivated.
Right. I know. It's so different from the way we're raised in America. I mean, we're just raised with this mindset of mine, everything's mine, and the whole quote-unquote American dream is to like get as much pie as you can get. If you leave any on the table, you're a fool.
Yeah. And this is where we come with the concept of pests. We name certain species pests. Like, how dare you come into my house, you little ant? You know, how dare you dig up my garden, you little ground squirrel?
Right.
Like, you're a pest. And as soon as you label an animal a pest, guess what? You get to destroy them with impunity.
Yeah.
Because they're coming into your territory, even though we're in their territory.
Right.
Kemmerer has a section on autonomy. Autonomy, auto meaning self, and nomos meaning law or governance. Seeing animals as having their own ability and right to self-governance. One of the many examples she gives is Shawang in Malaysia. Morality also requires humans to respect the autonomy of other creatures. A Shawang story tells of two young people who suffered for failing to respect a squirrel's autonomy. The young couple did not intend to be cruel. They captured a squirrel and kept her as a much-loved pet, robbing her of individual freedom as well as her proper place in the wilds. As a result, the guardian of all animals went into a fury at the plight of a single tiny squirrel. The animal guardian brought a raging storm down on the couple, snuffing out not only their lives but their souls for such a grave offense against the squirrel. In the Shawang worldview, each creature has a role to play, and proper behavior on the part of humans vis-a-vis animals must be observed. For example, as this story demonstrates, wild animals must not be trapped or detained or domesticated. The whole morality around pets comes up for me here.
Oh, yeah. I thought the same thing.
The whole domestication of animals is definitely a Western European holdover from this era of everything is ours to do whatever we want with.
Right.
To use as our little entertainment and to manipulate genetically and to, you know.
But then we also tell ourselves these stories, man's best friend, a dog. And yeah, don't get me wrong, you can get the sense that once you get to know an animal, there is this mutual affection, but getting to that place, we didn't ask their permission.
Right.
All right, continuing on. The Dasana, northwestern Amazon in Colombia, also respect the autonomy of animals, by giving a wide berth to critical wild habitat, places frequented by animals. They hold particular waterholes and wallows as sacred sanctuaries for wildlife alone, protected from human meddling by Vaimaz, the great protector of animals. Humans are expected to scrupulously avoid such places, and if they pass close by, they must pass in silence. Humans are not to disturb the ocelot or anaconda who come for a drink or a bath.
We think of animal sanctuaries and preserves as such a modern idea.
Right.
But indigenous people were like, that place is just for animals. We don't need to go there.
Right.
We can leave them alone.
Well, a lot of times in America, a refuge is an afterthought. Sometimes, we have these protected areas and we still maintain or protect a portion of it. We take a bigger portion of it. But then in some cases, after we've developed an area, then we're like, oh, wait a minute. We're messing up this habitat. I guess we better put this little refuge in. It doesn't go into the whole calculus of the thing.
The next section was super intriguing. Oh my gosh.
Yes. Very.
And it definitely corroborated what we read in Rilera and other sources when we were getting set up to do our animal sacrifices segment of this show, which is that early indigenous people had such a huge amount of guilt and even fear around the any necessity that they experienced to have to kill animals for clothing or for food. And I think this is such an important point for so many reasons. But for one, it flies in the face of the popular understanding of ancient peoples.
Yeah.
We are all given this picture of the caveman, the Stone Age person, the Native American person, whatever, who loved to hunt, loved to make weapons and go out and kill to survive. We're never taught that they experienced incredible dissonance and inner conflict and guilt over having to do that, and then came up with rituals to make it less offensive to the gods or to God.
Right.
Or to the animal world. But that's what's coming up when you actually start to look at the literature of people who have studied these ancient civilizations. That's what animal sacrifice was all about. That's what the hunting rituals were all about, was we have to do this, but we're going to put this ritual around it to help us assuage our immense guilt.
One of the things we did learn, though, is that the Native Americans would try to use every part of a bison or a buffalo, everything, like from the, not just the hide and the meat, but the horns and the ligaments inside. My point is that there was this sense that they tried to use every part of that animal out of respect, out of something, which I didn't fully understand all of it until I read this chapter, that the respect part of it, like if we're going to take this animal, we can't waste any of it. I don't know. That was the sense I was drawing in reading this.
Definitely.
And also, like you said, the guilt, right? I think if you had guilt, you probably are like, well, let me make the most of this.
Oh, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Here we go. We're going to read from this section. Many indigenous creation stories tell of a time when there was no bloodshed, a time when animals lived peacefully in community with one another, sharing one language and one culture. A Hopi myth recalls a time when many Hopis lived at Oribe, with birds and animals living as equals among them. The Cherokee remember a time of universal peace when humans and animals freely communicated, including hoary marmot and human and great blue heron. The Cheyenne of the Great Plains remember the original creation, a world where people and animals lived in peace. None, neither people nor animals, ate flesh. A Navajo myth recalls a time when there was plenty of food for everyone, and all creatures spoke the same language, and they all had the teeth, claws, feet, and wings of insects. Navajo people remember that these early humans could remove their wings, they lived in caves, and humans ate only what food they could gather and eat raw, such as nuts, seeds, roots, and berries. They were vegan, holding to a completely plant-based diet.
Indigenous myths also record how the interrelatedness of the creation is disturbed.
Yeah.
So she names all these cultures that believed in a time before predation ever entered in the picture, where everyone was vegan. And then they also had as part of their myth an explanation for how things went so wrong, how things went badly. And there's various accounts for that. Indigenous myths also record how the interrelatedness of the creation is disturbed, why and how killing and predation broke the original great peace. Cherokee myths recall that humans greedily began to kill animals for fur and food. It was easy to do at this time as the animals were completely unprepared to be hunted, and they walked right up to human beings, trusting them. One of the cultures, the Maoris in New Zealand, they saw the disruption of the peace as different gods fighting with each other.
Right.
And bringing in traps and nooses for the rival gods' creatures.
Right. You did a thing on Clement of Alexandria where the eating of flesh, it almost seemed corrupt. And here it talks about defiling somebody by cooking and eating them. And I think that's fascinating when it's described that way, that it's an aberration to eat flesh.
Totally. They always portray flesh eating as a cruel aberration, as in, this is not okay.
Right.
This is not the way it's
This
supposed
is not normal. This is warped. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is outside the bounds of sane.
Yeah. Indigenous myths that remember a great peace, a vegan world where all species consumed only plants and plant products and shared space peacefully, invariably remember this vegan world as superior.
That's awesome, right?
Indigenous myths portray the present state of perpetual violence, of predation and consumption as inferior to the original great peace. Interspecies violence, eating one another, is identified as a great loss for all involved.
Right. And there's this one group, the Maori, they say that a deadly diet assures there will be no peace on earth. And we've heard other vegans speak this way. Maybe it's Tolstoy. As long as there are slaughterhouses, there's never going to be peace.
I have to ask myself, the fact that this shows up in at least several indigenous traditions, this belief that at the beginning, all species had peace with each other, coexisted peacefully, and there was no predation. Where did that idea come from? Where did the guilt come from? It definitely lines up with the Hebrew creation myth, which shows that at the beginning, the intention is for everyone just to eat plants and have peace.
Right.
Continuing to talk about this guilt that indigenous hunters felt, their troubled consciences, she explains that they developed a mythology or a worldview in which it was believed that animals gave his or her life as a gift to the hunter. You could see how this helped them with their guilt a lot. If they believe that, oh, this animal sees that I'm hungry or that my family or my community is hungry, and this animal is coming and willingly giving me their life. And they further assuage their guilt by saying that there's a cyclical nature to life. So when this animal gives me their life, they will come back again.
Yeah.
They will have life again.
Right.
They're having this ongoing existential conflict
Right.
that they have to somehow sleep at night.
Right.
And so this is the best they could do. But this respect that they had required balance, and that they would never take more than what was needed. Hunting without necessity is contrary to indigenous spiritual beliefs and practices. Such killing is dangerous, taboo, and contrary to ancient lifeways. The Waswanipi Cree hunter in the Canadian subarctic, while noting that technology and modern techniques allow humans to take life beyond what is necessary, cautions against doing so. He notes that killing animals for fun or self-aggrandizement demonstrates the ultimate disdain for other creatures.
And also, she has this very interesting quote when she's talking about the afterlife. The Mayans anticipate sharing the afterlife with animals. Most likely, they would be appalled at the thought of an afterlife devoid of agouti, spider monkeys, dogs, owls, eye butterflies, marine toads, tarantulas, singing quail, and nurse sharks. And what that does for me, it makes me want to look into our text, the Christian text, and see what is God saying about animals. And we already know this. They're in the eternal state. That's in some ways, Valera's like, hey, all you need are these two things and you're good. No, if you see animals in the eternal state and they're living in peace and harmony, what does that say about our current state, how our current ethics should be?
That just reminds me, I know I've heard someone, when they were addressing Isaiah 11, where all the animals are living peacefully and eating plants, they're like, oh, you can't take that literally. Obviously, this is a metaphor. I'm like, why wouldn't you take this literally? Why are you making that hermeneutical choice?
But that's exactly
Because we can't imagine that animals matter.
If God created the entire world, humans, animals, and the natural world, but he only saves the humans, that means the humans are going to be suspended in space somewhere because all he cares about are the humans. But no, he put the humans in a terrestrial place that he created with animals, with plants. So he's going to save it all.
This is a really good segue, actually, into the next section where she's saying that in these indigenous traditions, the myths teach of a higher power that protects animals, a power that expects human beings to show tremendous respect for animals. In this worldview, animals are not envisioned as gifts from God for our purposes. They are not ours to use and exploit. They are independent and have their own relationship with the Creator.
Right.
This is a biblical idea that we never, ever take seriously.
Right.
That
Exactly. We do not take it seriously.
Each animal has their own relationship with the Creator, praises God in their own way. They are a sacred being who matter to God.
Right.
She relays a Mayan myth, which I thought, well, let's just read it and see if it reminds you of anything.
Okay. You, the deer, sleep along the rivers, in the canyons. Be here in the meadows, in the thickets, in the forests. Multiply yourselves. You precious birds, your nests, your houses are in the trees, in the bushes. Multiply there. Scatter there. In the branches of trees, the branches of bushes.
For me, that phrase, multiply yourselves, that is like a direct quote. And she goes on, the Mayan creation story explains that the Creator intended animals to prosper in their native habitat.
Yeah, that's everything right there. That's what I feel is so fascinating, that God created a habitat that is perfect for these animals, and they're thriving in it. What does that say about who they are and who he intended them to be? That there's a habitat built for them.
What does that say about God's desires for them?
Yeah.
And what does that say about our right to deprive them of what God has given them?
Deprive them and or destroy their habitat that he created for them.
Yeah, so here is a good spot to really articulate these parallels to our faith, these parallels to our tradition, a pre-predation state, i.e. Eden state. This idea of God saying, multiply yourselves, I've given you everything you need to thrive.
Right.
And that animals are not here as gifts to humans. They're here on their own right.
Right.
And another thing that keeps coming up is how many of these indigenous societies had, as part of their mythology, a great flood. How do they all have such similar stories to the one we're familiar with?
Right. Many ancient Near Eastern myths have the flood in them as well.
Indigenous traditions do not think about or speak of a species boundary. Instead, they see all animals as kin and view a species similarly to how progressive human beings view skin color. It looks different, but what lies underneath is what matters. And under our skin, we are fundamentally the same. She has a subheading called Animal Powers, which is really fun. A lot of these indigenous traditions viewed animals as, in many ways, superior to humans.
Right.
Humans only survive with the help and intervention and assistance by animals. Some of these indigenous traditions believe that animals have supernatural powers, even able to tell the future and even sometimes warn humans. There's the Okanagan people of northern Washington state that specifically remember that human beings are exceptionally helpless, the most helpless of all animals. One of the stories she tells in this section I really liked. Navajo mythology includes a flood story in which turkey, an animal much maligned by Western humans, is given considerable credit. In this story, turkey warns people of the coming flood, even instructing them to head for higher ground. Turkey also remembers not to leave without life-sustaining seeds for cultivation, which all of the humans have forgotten in their rush to escape the rising waters. With this important insight, Turkey assures the survival of those who have escaped this flood. Because Turkey returns to gather the forgotten seeds, she falls behind the others, and the flood waters lap at her tail as she waddles up the trail to safety, providing the characteristic white fringe on her otherwise shimmering black tail. I love that story.
Yeah.
And she talks more about these flood stories. And in a lot of them, different animals play a role where they can be safe, where they can hide, where they can, and when it's safe to come out.
While indigenous religious traditions recognize animals as fundamentally the same under their skins, they grant extraordinary powers to many animals, if not all animals, whether they are viewed as more sensitive and aware than humanity, as essential to reaching transcendent powers, or as critical to the creation of earth and or humanity. Bats, beavers, and buffalo are likely to be viewed as holding exceptional powers, even dangerous powers.
At this point, she goes into the fear that a lot of indigenous people would have. Fear that if they do not behave appropriately, animals are going to stop helping them.
Yeah.
Animals are going to stop offering themselves to the hunter and the fisher.
If humans take too much, kind of like our capitalist culture, right? If we overdo it, if we don't show proper respect, then the animals will stop, in essence, sacrificing themselves or helping or assisting humans.
She quotes from a source talking about the Koyukon people again. Each animal knows way more than we do. The old people told us never to bother anything unless we really needed it. When a hunter brings home food, there's no talk of skill, no place for boasting, only deep appreciation for Arctic ground squirrels and rock ptarmigan who choose to die so that the Koyukon might live. The Wareo, again from Venezuela, show respect and exercise caution by rotating which ecological zone, aquatic, terrestrial, arboreal, or aerial, they target in their search for food, showing respect for hunted animals, killing no more than is necessary, particularly from any one zone, and never allowing an animal to suffer is critical for the survival of their human community. Mm-hmm. What a progressive idea that if we have to take animals' lives, let's rotate where we're taking those animals' lives from so that we're not over exploiting any one area.
Right. There was a portion in this earlier in this chapter talking about mechanized processes, and that in essence, the moment you introduce any mechanized process, say like slaughterhouses, animal agriculture, you've crossed the line.
Mm-hmm. Whether he be hunting or fishing, he knows that his every action is monitored by the spirit guardians and the members of the communities he targets. To minimize the damage he inflicts on any one species, he hunts and fishes in various places. Should he abuse a species by overexploitation or by allowing a creature to die a slow and painful death, the spirits of the victimized may target him and his kinfolk for retribution. The worst imaginable scenario ensues when a guardian spirit, disgruntled over immoderation, gathers his or her community and moves away to another region, leaving the people of the abuser without food. Wow. It's kind of mind-blowing. It's how you feel at the end of this chapter. And she's going to end each chapter talking about contemporary people from each religious tradition, specifically contemporary people who are animal activists. And I love this section very much. She calls this last section Indigenous Traditions and Animal Liberation.
Nice. Animal liberation. All right. Because most peoples no longer need to hunt, trap, or fish for food, some indigenous peoples maintain historic traditions in contemporary times by denouncing such unnecessary killing, which not only saves the lives of animals, but also prevents the environmentally destructive effects of these practices when modern methods are employed. For example, in January 2000, 4 indigenous groups in western Washington accepted 300 pounds of deer and elk flesh from alongside roadways. They gave up their legal right to hunt in exchange for subsisting on roadkill. These indigenous people demonstrated that their ancient ethic of respect for nature, their commitment to kill only when necessary, and their vision of harmony and kinship are alive and well. That's fascinating.
Oh, I know.
Because there's a lot of roadkill.
I know. She talks about Maka elders who stood against a renewed whale hunt planned by other members of their community. They openly spoke against reestablishing the Maka whale hunt along the coast of Washington state on the grounds that such a hunt was billed as traditional and sacred when it was neither. Maka elders expressed their concerns in the Peninsula Daily News. Quote, "We are elders of the Maka Indian Nation, which means people of the Cape. We oppose this whale hunt our tribe is going to do. The whale hunt issue has never been brought to the people to inform them, and there is no spiritual training going on. We believe they, the council, will just shoot the whale, and we think the word subsistence is the wrong thing to say when our people haven't used or had whale meat or blubber since the early 1900s. For these reasons, we believe the hunt is only for the money. They can't say, quote, traditional, spiritual, and for subsistence in the same breath when no training is going on. Just talk. Whale watching is an alternative we support." It would be one thing if the whale meat were truly needed, Thompson added, as in the times of the ancestors, but that is no longer true today. Hunting when flesh is no longer necessary for survival and defending such practices as central to indigenous spiritual traditions is a bastardization of indigenous spiritual traditions. It is not surprising that indigenous peoples have aligned with animal liberation, working to free earth and animals from the clutches of capitalism and consumerism. And she's going to start talking about one specific person, Linda Fisher, who is Ojibwe and Cherokee from the Great Lakes region, and is a tribal member of the Ojibwe Nation, is a professional artist and an animal liberationist.
Fisher is also quick to note that Native Americans traditionally ate very little meat. The conventional Hollywood depiction of the Native American diet and lifestyle is false. The Americas were a rich and fertile land, providing plentiful berries, vegetables, nuts, beans, squash, roots, fruits, corn, and rice. Most tribal people survived comfortably, eating meat sparingly while thriving on the cornucopia of the land. European influence introduced Native people to commercial trade and firepower, and buffalo began to be killed in great numbers. Only recently has meat become an important staple. Europeans and immigrants believe that meat is a critical part of the human diet, but ancient Native Americans had a much more varied diet. Europeans are carrying their meaty ways overseas to other lands as well. In China today, meat is served much more heavily in restaurants where European Americans eat, whereas locals have for centuries eaten a mostly vegetarian diet. It now appears that this introduced diet of heavy meat is harming native cultures and causing health problems such as diabetes, cancer, and heart disease.
I've recently watched a presentation given by a Mexican couple saying the same thing. Before European colonists came, we ate mostly plants.
Wow.
And we need to get back to that because the Western diet is killing our community. And I've seen the same thing said of the Aborigine people in Australia. Before they were colonized, they had a much healthier plant-based diet.
Well, that's fascinating, right? Because we also rewrote their histories for our purposes.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have this picture of them that they almost only ate meat.
Right.
This colonized idea. Like, I feel like more and more, a lot of this veganism study is confronting colonialism.
Yeah.
And how colonialized our thinking is.
Yeah.
The other indigenous contemporary animal liberationist that she talks about is a gentleman named Rod Coronado, a Pasca Yaqui from the Sonoran Desert of northern Mexico and southern Arizona, is also an animal liberationist. For more than 20 years, he fought corporate and government policies which are harmful to earth and animals. So he joined the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society to protect sea creatures and the seas. He ended up sinking 2 illegal whaling ships off the coast of Iceland, and he ended up destroying half of Iceland's whaling fleet.
Wow.
And also caused $2 million worth of damage to their whaling station. After that, he joined the Animal Liberation Front.
Wow.
And he was jailed for a series of attacks on animal testing operations and fur facilities. He caused $125,000 in damage to Michigan State University, and he freed many caged mink. He was also jailed for spreading lion urine to protect mountain lions from hunters because urine confuses the hunting hounds, and for dismantling the lion traps. He's also just been jailed, which was a violation of his free speech. Basically, he said something that people didn't like and put him back in jail, which flies in the face, obviously, of the U.S. Constitution.
Right.
And she says it's because people understand that he's just better off behind bars, because if he's out, he's going to be causing trouble.
Yeah, it's like he's committed.
Yeah.
Wow.
He says, when I returned to the res and started hanging out with the elders, direct action, deep ecology, radical environmentalism, whatever you want to call it, were all part of the sacred knowledge handed down orally. Spirituality for me is not only about sustenance, but a kind of roadmap one uses to successfully navigate through life. When who you are and what you are is about the earth, you learn that your own true power can only come from the earth. It is power that comes not out of fear, but through simply listening and learning the lessons of how to live harmoniously with the rhythms of nature. As an Indigenous person, I've had to relearn that fighting for the earth is a very old, sacred, and honorable duty. I'm like totally getting choked up. Whew.
Wow.
Yeah, very strong. So he's not only a badass, he's also like really intelligent,
Right.
and obviously very spiritual.
In summary, Indigenous religious traditions around the world continue to provide an ancient yet living vision of nature as sacred, requiring human respect and entailing human responsibilities. Animals are understood to be people living in community as humans live in community, all of whom are part of a larger community of living beings. Indigenous religious traditions teach people that we owe respect, responsibility, and compassion to our non-human kin. And remember a time of great peace before predation began. Most indigenous peoples believe that all beings are endowed with souls. Animals are generally thought to hold exceptional abilities and remarkable powers. Indigenous myths teach that animals are creators and that they hold the power to decide whether or not they will die at the hands of a hungry hunter. Indigenous peoples often fear the power of nature, including the powers of animals, should they offend their powerful kin on whom they depend for survival. I read that and I'm thinking stewardship.
Yeah. Something that she says here that we didn't really name earlier is that they believe that animals have souls.
Yeah.
For her to say it that way, I mean, she's been kind of saying it all along.
Right.
But that lines up with the Hebrew creation narrative.
Absolutely.
Which, again, we don't take seriously.
Right.
We don't concentrate on. We don't focus on. But it's right there in black and white.
Right. And as you mentioned earlier in this chapter, there are many Native American traditions and many different peoples that around the world that saw animals having souls, and she mentions many of them. I think if you get your hands on this book, Animals and World Religions by Lisa Kemmerer, I think you'd be fascinated. It's been very enlightening, very intriguing. I've only read the intro in the first chapter, and I already have so many questions.
Yeah. No, I'm really glad that we decided to do this right now. I feel like it's really important work, and it's going to help us with our theology a lot.
Oh, absolutely.
So thank you, everybody, for being here with us. Next week, we're going to talk about Hinduism. I'm really excited about that, too.
Yeah.
So have a great day.
Yeah, later.